happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GBNews.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hey, welcome along. There are two kinds of public policy these days. One in which a politician announces something and 90% of his voters go, ha ha, very funny. He doesn't really mean that, you know, don't worry about it. For example, Boris Johnson has announced a ban on the internal combustion engine by 2030. That's in 8 years' time. So naturally, everybody laughs and says, well, he's only doing that because of the missus. Don't give it another thought. As has been pointed out on this show, there is no way that the 36 million people who presently hold UK driving licenses can all switch to electric. Because if you think it's pretty bad waiting to fill up at the BP by the mini roundabout, wait till you're needing to recharge your car to get home from the office and the queue's backed up halfway to Watford Gap. So the plan clearly, actually pretty obviously, is to reduce dramatically individual vehicle ownership. Oh, don't worry, you'll be able to get on a train when the strike ends. Or maybe a plane once all that chaos at the airport has eased. Gee, it's almost like they don't really want us going anywhere at all. But if you do insist on going somewhere, rent an electric charabanc for a day trip to Wales. Oh, very jolly that. And it works just as well for Bangor County Down as it does for Bangor in whatever renamed Welsh county Bangor is in now. Actually, it works just as well if you're all alone in a darkened room in your flat. You don't actually need even to go on a big day out. Then there's the other kind of public policy, you know, where the government insists it really wants to ship all these fellows off to Rwanda right away. But instead, all the organs of the state, the Border Force, the Royal Navy, the Home Office, are meeting these chappies halfway across the channel and express checking them into the UK. You may think you voted for a party pledged to crack down on illegal immigration, but as a practical matter, they're on the other side. Something similar is happening with the so-called grooming gangs of Rotherham, Telford, Oxford, and what is it now? Oldham. If the police and the social services and the politicians and the media were all working for the grooming gangs, what exactly would they be doing differently? We'll get into that with Laura Perrins, plus Anne Elizabeth Moutet, Natalie Winters and Deborah So on French women, bat women, unhappy women, all kinds of women. It's way more fun than a charabanc to Bangor, and it's all coming up after Bethany with the latest headlines.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Bethany Elsey here to get you up to date from the GB newsroom. The UK's biggest rail strike for almost 3 decades is underway, causing major travel disruption to millions of people. 80% of train services are cancelled today, and there's more to come. Members of the RMT union will walk out again on Thursday and Saturday, but the knock-on effects will be felt all week. Rail staff are concerned about jobs and working conditions. They're demanding a pay rise in line with inflation, but Network Rail's Chief Executive Andrew Haynes told GB News to fund it, practices will have to be modernised.
We either tax the taxpayer more, or we as a system become more efficient. And I think the first option would be unforgivable given all else that's going on at the moment. So we've got to become more efficient. We've put forward really credible, reasonable changes to working practices which would make us a more efficient business, and we could then share some of that in a decent pay rise to our colleagues. And the RMT, they walked away from the talks and they're having their moment of glory, but it's a real shame.
A man who murdered a couple in their home while their children slept upstairs has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 38 years. Stephen and Jennifer Chappell were both stabbed 6 times in November last year in Norton Fitzwarren near Taunton. Colin Reeves, who served in Afghanistan, killed the couple after a long-running dispute over parking. A police investigation is underway after the death of a woman and child in Barnet in North London. Officers were called to a property by the ambulance service earlier today. They found a woman and a 5-year-old girl believed to be her daughter with stab wounds. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. A man has been arrested on suspicion of their murder. And the Director of Public Safety in Texas said the law enforcement response to the Uvalde school shooting, in which 19 children and 2 teachers were killed, was an abject failure. Stephen McCraw told a Texas Senate hearing that terrible decisions were made by the on-site commander and officers who responded. He blamed a lack of training, which he says lost valuable time that may have saved lives. He criticised police who waited to enter the classroom where the shooting occurred while they sought a key, despite the fact the door wasn't locked. On TV, online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News. Now, let's get back to Mark.
Thank you, Bethany. It is truly disgraceful, that performance of the police in Uvalde, Texas. Basically, that body count, all those dead kids, are because of the pathetic failure of those so-called policemen, all of whom should be ashamed and actually go and find some alternative means of employment. Speaking of police, it is 10 years since the Rotherham scandal planted the evasive phrase grooming gangs in the language. The scandal in Rotherham wasn't just the serial gang rape of children, but the utter indifference to it and indeed enabling of it by police, politicians and social workers. But a decade on, and here we are in the umpteenth English town, which is it, Telford? No. Rochdale? No. Oxford? No. Oldham. Oldham. As in the splendid English music hall joke, what's the best way to Oldham? And so all pretending to be shocked that all the same things that went on in Rotherham were going on in Oldham, only more so. As I mentioned yesterday, the very leader of the grooming gang, a chap called Shabir Ahmed, well, there he is, lovely fellow, was working for the council for years on end as a, quote, welfare rights officer, even though his extracurricular activities were well known to police. He ran his grooming gang out of the welfare office, because that's very convenient. Raped over 30 girls. It gets worse. How about this line from the official report? Sophie was abducted from Oldham Police Station. Whoa, hold up there. Sophie was abducted from Oldham Police Station? How does that happen? Well, it did. Sophie was 12 years old. She went to Oldham Police Station to report that she had been sexually assaulted by, quote, an Asian male known only as Ali in the graveyard of Oldham Parish Church. Because in Oldham and many other English towns, that seems to be the main purpose of the Church of England these days, at least as far as their churchyards are concerned. The desk officer wasn't interested in Sophie. He told her to come back when she wasn't drunk. Oh, by the way, is that guy still working for Greater Manchester Police? It gets better. After she'd been sloughed off by the desk cop, Sophie stood in the police station and two men beckoned her over and asked if she'd like to get in their car. The American bank robber Willie Sutton, asked why he robbed banks, famously replied, because that's where the money is. Why do Oldham's child rapists work for Oldham Social Services and hang out in the Oldham police station? Because that's where the vulnerable girls are. And the gang-raping pedos are so secure, they know you can pick girls up in the cop shop and the coppers won't do anything. So Sophie and the guys exited Oldham police station and in the car, one of them raped her. They dropped her at Werneth Park and she asked a man for directions, Sarwar Ali by name. Mr. Ali took her home and raped her again, third time that day. For 12-year-old Sophie, but the day is young and just getting started. Mr. Ali was considerate enough when his appetites were sated to give her the bus fare. She left the house and another man, Shakil Chowdhury, there he is, Shakil Chowdhury, posing as a cab driver, got her in the car and drove her to a house in Attock Close, where four other blokes were waiting, and they raped her all through the night for a 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th time, until they'd all satisfied themselves, and then one of them very kindly dropped her off at home on the way back to his pad. She was raped continuously by 7 men. All because the desk officer at Oldham Police Station told a 12-year-old rape victim she was drunk and to go away. Do these guys' names suggest any particular pattern? The first bloke in the park was called Ali, A-L-I. The fellow in the first house was Sarwar Ali. In the second house, it was Shakil Chowdhury. So these names are all... Oh, no. Don't you even think it. Don't even think it. As all the reports say, and as the media say, these are quote-unquote Asian men. Could be Hong Kongers who fled to Oldham and Rotherham and Rochdale and Telford and your town here. Could be Japanese sumo wrestlers parachuted in during the war. Chinese virologists from Wuhan dropping off the next variant. Washed up K-pop bands from Korea. Misplaced Gurkha regiments from Nepal. Abandoned mail order brides from Thailand because they turned out to be fetching young ladyboys. Asia is the world's largest and most populous continent. It starts at the Urals River. Before the 19th century, Asia was generally taken to start at the Don River, which is even further west. That's the Don River in Russia, not the one in Rotherham. Although from the media's framing it might as well be. Asia is home to over 60% of the world's population. So the term Asian men is marginally more helpful than saying we believe the majority of these gang rapists are earthlings. And what the term Asian men tells the groomers in Oldham and everywhere else is that the media have no stomach for the hard, cruel realities any more than social services or the police did. Which is how it happens that a young girl can seek sanctuary in the one place in town she ought to be safe, the police station, and instead meet only her next predators. And it's because of the way we cover this that the story doesn't go away. Rotherham arose because the people who run that town didn't want to get into the idea that Muslim men, Pakistani Muslim men, are running these gangs. So the coverage has always been dishonest. Oh, Asian men, Asian men. No, it's a little bit more specific than that. And if we're not prepared to address it honestly, then the girls are going to carry on getting raped and raped and raped and raped. If they're lucky, it won't be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times in a single day like it was for poor Sophie, but they're still going to get raped. Let me know your take, gbviews at gbnews.uk. Laura Perrins writes for the indispensable website, The Conservative Woman. She and Kathy Gingell do a great job over there, and you'll read all kinds of things you won't see in the daily papers. These reports are all different, Laura, and yet after a decade, they're all the same, almost as if the familiarity of the reports is intended to anaesthetize you to the reality.
Well, evening, Mark. I mean, it really is a shocking report. It's a very long report. It's over 202 pages long, and I managed to read quite a bit of it, but admittedly not all of it. And I must, if I may, commend you for how you set up and explain to the viewer exactly what happened to a girl. It wasn't her real name they used, but they called her Sophie in the report. And it's, I think, to bring it home to the viewer, you know, just imagine what that girl suffered. She was only 12 years of age. And as you laid out, you nearly need a crib sheet to understand what happened to her on a single night. And that was being sexually abused in a churchyard, as you said, and then she goes to the police station. And if you're watching this, you know, on your Netflix detective series, most of the time you think, well, when the victim goes to the police station, you know, that's it. Thank God this is over. But actually, that was just the beginning of what is just, you do lose words to describe, an absolutely horrific series of events where she was basically raped in the car, raped again somewhere else, and then very kindly they all seemed to release her and pay for various bus fares. And amazingly, she'd be picked up by another person, only for the final unbelievable event where she was raped by at least, I think, 5 men in a house. And remember, if something like this happened in a war, say, if something like that happened, right, soldiers carried out that type of attack on a single person, it would trigger the biggest sort of military, you know, tribunal. It will be considered essentially a crime against humanity for something like that to happen in a single night against such a young girl. And yet this happened, as you said, in Oldham. It was truly shocking, for her to be turned away at the police station. But as I read it, I thought, this can't be a mere coincidence. It was never said in the report, but I don't mind saying it now, that I sense those multiple attacks were coordinated. There is no way something like that could happen, and where she seems to be amazingly picked up, you know, one attack after the other. So I sense that this was essentially, we all know that they involve gangs, they're grooming gangs, they're all linked. They were linked through the nighttime economy, as it was described, through shisha bars and through taxi drivers. And I sense that one incident, which is, as I said, essentially a crime against humanity, was probably coordinated.
Well, you've just made a brilliant point there, Laura, because I hadn't actually thought of it in those terms, but my old friend Louise Arbour, who was the United Nations High Commissioner in this area, and she was the first to prosecute rape as an act of war in Sudan and Bosnia. And you're quite correct to say that if 5 men had gotten together and done this to a girl in Sudan or Bosnia, it would be a war crime. But in England, apparently it isn't. And I don't know why we are more sensitive about these things when they happen in Sudan or when they happen in the Balkans. But it surely doesn't speak well for us that we turn a blind eye to it up and down the spine of England.
Well, a blind eye was certainly turned at the time. I mean, we have to acknowledge that they have instigated the report now, and it was very long. And the report was careful to say that they didn't find any evidence of a cover-up. And actually, so that's the first point. But the second point is, when I was reading the report, there is a lot of jargon, and various systems were already, because this was somewhat later in the sort of grooming gang scandal. So by now they had started to react to it, and they had sort of what would seem to be a messenger system, and then there's called multi-agency response units. But still, when I read it, I thought, you know, you have all of these systems in place. Some people may well have been trying their very best, and yet still these offences happen. And you're left asking yourself, what else do they have to put in place? You know, how many agencies need to be part of the multi-agency group to stop 12-year-old girls being raped on multiple occasions by multiple men in a single night? I mean, the other quote that stood out for me, and it was an allegation, was that residents on a particular street had raised concerns that young children were being taken to the house where this girl, Sophie, ended up being raped by multiple men. But that essentially taxis would amass on the street every Wednesday night and children would be taken to the address in a conveyor belt fashion. Now, again, when you hear phrases like that, even if it's in an allegation form that perhaps has never been resolved, it is shocking. It's completely shocking that something like this would happen, and we certainly should maintain our shock, and we shouldn't become jaded to it at all. And going back to your first introduction, again, you know, it just really sort of sums how bad things were at the time, certainly, that the person who was given a 22-year jail sentence, and believe you me, you have to do some horrific things in Great Britain to get a 22-year jail sentence. He'll only serve half of that, by the way, was, of course, the welfare rights officer at Oldham Council. I mean, again, and I'm just reading that, so sorry if my eyes have gone. It just sums up a really shocking state of affairs in terms of, you know, you can put in as many systems as you like, but people still don't seem to be able to react in a common sense way and say, if this guy has just been convicted of an offence, I think isn't he the welfare rights officer guy at Oldham Council? Maybe we should tell them, because he probably has access to a lot of vulnerable people.
Yeah, this is exactly the same thing that went on in Rotherham. We were told then that the police and the social workers, they didn't want to complain. In this case, he's a prominent member of the Pakistani Muslim community in Oldham. And we were told in Rotherham that, well, you know, it's all very difficult. I don't want to be tied up in sensitivity training for the next 6 months because I'm reporting a Muslim guy for child rape. How have we reached the situation where decade in, decade out, we still can't even talk honestly about, everyone is still walking on diversity eggshells, and there's no honesty about what's going on?
Yes, well, I mean, that is obviously the huge elephant in the room, although I sort of reread about 3 times an opening quote from the report saying that, I'm not quoting it in full because I can't pull it up right now, but it sort of said, throughout the sort of investigation, you know, members of the council and the police were sensitive to issues that this could, the report's words were rightly sensitive that, you know, raising these issues would sort of give succor to the far right. But despite that, there was no conspiracy, there was no cover up, and they investigated it properly. And to me, I just thought, well, should the report even be using that language? I mean, is it right to say, oh yes, there are concerns that this would set off the far right were completely legitimate? I mean, you know, to me, the far right is tiny. People keep looking for it everywhere, but we seem to be in a supply shortage in Britain. But offences against children and people who are willing to commit offences against children, there's plenty of those people. So I just don't think we should care about who might be annoyed when it comes to committing very serious offences against children. And institutions across the board should stop protecting their own interests and start protecting the interests of young children.
No, well, that's a completely ridiculous reason they give. We didn't want to step in and prevent this 12-year-old girl being raped 10 times in one night because Tommy Robinson might use it for publicity. I mean, that's what we've reached in the complete, total failure of the British state to protect its most vulnerable girls. We're going to stay on this story. Thank you very much, Laura. Conservativewoman.co.uk. gbnews.uk, and you should bookmark it before the atrocious British Board of Film Censors bury it completely. Up next, your take, GB Views at gbnews.uk, plus Anne Elizabeth Mute, Natalie Winters, Deborah So. Don't touch that dial, we're coming right back.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping it.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hey, let's get to your comments. Katie says, is anything ever going to be done about grooming gangs? I doubt it. There were grooming gangs in Wolverhampton 50 years ago. Let me say, that's 1972. Stories were published in the Express and Star. It was known to the locals, young and vulnerable girls being abused. Katie, not far down the road from you is Telford, which is a new town. And if you actually look at the dates and the timeline of what happened in Telford, you will, in Shropshire or whatever phony baloney county they've reassigned it to now, you will see that in Telford, basically, this scandal goes back to the very earliest years of the town. In other words, almost as soon as they built it, this was happening. Deborah says, mainstream media, a quick few lines, then it's over quick to the next headline. So obvious they do not want to talk about it. Yes, let's talk about cake. Let's talk about curry. Let's talk about ginger growlers. Let's talk about some guy from some movie visiting Kiev to prance around with Zelensky. Let's talk about Bono busking in the tube station in Kiev. Let's talk about anything except the maidenhood of England being serially gang raped for years on end in these towns. Colin says Labour tries to hide it or to blame the victims. The Conservatives would only care if it was one of their own daughters. The Libs and Greens would blame climate change. Labour doesn't want to because of the Muslim vote is very important to it. And for some reason, Labour is so condescending towards Britain's Muslim community that they seem to think that all their Muslim voters will be upset if the Muslims who commit child rape are called out about it. So Labour is basically making a political calculation that you can't talk about it because of the names of the perpetrators. That's the deal they've made. The Conservatives don't seem to care about it because these are happening in Labour towns. I don't even know why they don't exploit it just for nakedly political reasons. Rotherham's been a Labour town for the entirety of living memory. So why don't they want to talk about Rotherham? And Jonathan says 12 years and the Tories won't touch it. Yeah, that's true. Our friend Sammy Woodhouse, who's going to be here later this week, was brought down to David Cameron to meet with David Cameron. She's not political. At the time, she didn't know whether he was Labour or Tory. And she could see his eyes glazing over at number 10. She told me this. And David Cameron looking over the shoulder to see if there was anyone more important he should be schmoozing in the room. That's how much David Cameron cared about child rape. Just 2 months ago, the media consensus was that Marine Le Pen, or far-right Marine Le Pen, as the BBC calls her, I believe far-right is a kind of traditional aristocratic title in France. It's the, I think, equivalent of Marchioness, something like that. And the media were telling us that far-right Marine Le Pen was a pathetic far-right loser cat lady who'd bought herself a one-way ticket on the TGV to le cimetière politique. But in Sunday's parliamentary elections, the dinky metrosexual globalist Macron had a stinker of a night, and Madame Le Pen came out rather well. Anne-Elisabeth Boutet is the doyenne of Parisian commentators. Marine was at the Élysée Palace today. Is Madame Le Pen back?
Oh, she definitely is back, and her party is back. To be honest, Macron was flabbergasted by his defeat, and my spies during the national rally evening on Sunday night was they were flabbergasted by their victory. They thought they would do better. They didn't expect to have 89 MPs in the House, where the Républicain, Sarkozy's old party, only gets 63. So that was really a big shock. And if you look at the left-wing alliance, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's own France Unbowed only have 73 MPs. So the first single party of opposition not in alliance is actually the National Rally in France. That is a real upset for someone who people said would never get to even close to power.
Yeah, and that would make, in Westminster terms, that would make Madame Le Pen leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. It doesn't really work that way in France. But does it mean that Monsieur Macron is obliged to take her more seriously than he would have had things gone well for him?
Well, it's very interesting. She did not win the presidential election, as you know. Her party won the parliamentary elections. There now have been signals by members of the government that if they got on some bills that they want to introduce the support of the National Rally, they would not oppose it. This is huge because it means that the ring fencing around the National Rally in France, which people call the Front Républicain, the Republican Front, never admit the fascists in because that's the way they see them. Yeah. And it means that on some things, for instance, the Justice Minister, Éric Dupond-Moretti, said, if we have a bill and the bill is a bill to reform justice and some of the provisions are provisions that they would push anyway, why not accept their votes? This has created an outcry, but I think it's not the sort of thing that you say without checking it with the president, who's also your boss. And therefore, I think that Macron is ready to do absolutely anything as long as he remains the president and he's not completely incapacitated by a house leagued against him.
But there has been a sea change, as you said, in that the fascists have now been admitted within the precincts of respectable parties. Is that actually a big thing? I mean, are people reeling from it?
I think they haven't been admitted yet. I think they're on the threshold. As it is, you have a number of people who are now sort of saying this is impossible, we can't say this, it's not acceptable. I mean, you are used to all what people say. The other thing is that Marine Le Pen herself, coming out of the Élysée today, said if there are reasonable alliance, no, not alliance, but if we can find margins for which we can compromise and they are reasonable and acceptable to us, why not? And what she wants to show is that not, having been inside the circles of power, she's as deserving of being in the circles of power than many of the other people who say that they are ready to govern. It's very interesting. She looks much more reasonable than she was even at the time of the last election, but then she only won 8 MPs and now she's got 89.
Well, during the run-up to the presidential election, some hardcore fellows like me thought she'd rather overdone it in her plan to detoxify her father's brand and her father's party, as it were. But if it didn't pay off at the presidential level, it seems to have paid off at the parliamentary level. Do you think this keeps her in play as a potential French president?
I would say the detoxification has worked. The fact that when the Ukraine war started, she kept stum, even though she got loans from Russian banks because French banks would not give her loans for her campaign, whereas Éric Zemmour sort of, gave a fairly pro-Putinist line, and also because Éric Zemmour looked more radical than she did. And the result is that she has benefited from this because he moved the Overton window in terms of the debate rightwards, but he also moved it in a way that she looked more reasonable. And second, when you look at the choice that was given the French, first in the presidential election and now in most of the competitions in the second round, in the runoff last Sunday, you had, the choice was basically either the Mélenchoniste candidate or the presidential candidate or the National Rally candidate. You have people from the hard left who voted for the National Rally rather than vote for Macron, and you have people on the right who voted for NUPES, the populist left-wing party, rather than vote for Macron. What happened on Sunday was a vote of no confidence on Macron himself.
As I understand Monsieur Zemmour's position, though, his theory was that he was, when he entered, he didn't expect to win the election, but he thought he'd do well enough to cause a realignment on the right that would get rid of all these sissy boy Républicains and Madame Le Pen repositioning the party as a cat lovers party, and he'd reunify the right on his terms as something harder and butcher. That hasn't really happened, has it?
No, but that's not what he was trying to do. What he was trying to do, and he's the one who always talked about, he said the right will only succeed if they're united. He said, and quite rightly so, that there were 1/3 of the Républicain Party with whom, first of all, because he knew all these people, he'd been a very good political reporter for 30 years. He said, there's 1/3 of these people who belong with us, and we welcome the alliances. And he said, I welcome an alliance with Marine Le Pen because her voters have been cheated out of representation for so many decades. And it didn't work this time. And she was also, the evening he lost, he extended a hand and said, look, I'm not going to bargain. I'm going to say, to my voters, even though I disagree on some things with her, vote for Marine Le Pen. I will vote for Marine Le Pen. And he expected that there would be some sort of acceptance. She was pretty vindictive, and her people gave not a single seat, so that he was contested in the 7th constituency where he ran for MP, and the Rassemblement National came a few points before him. But if there had been only one candidate there, just as if there had been only one candidate somewhere else, he would have had a few MPs, not many. He would have been a junior member of a coalition. It's not happening now. I'm not ruling out the fact that even though you now get people on the right who look at this government and say, we're going to vote things ad hoc and we're going to vote with a National Rally ad hoc, I think there's a question of breaking the walls, and he's helped to do that. What's interesting is that they haven't got a single MP. He wasn't elected, was not in the second round of the presidential election. They are having what the French call une université d'été. They're calling all their sympathizers and militants for a study group in September in the southeast of France, which is not the best time to be in the southeast of France. These people are working in politics.
Yeah. Well, that's it's still a more interesting parliament than the UK's, where, as far as I can tell, now we've got like 12 left-wing parties, plus the Democratic Unionists from Ulster. So you're doing better in a more diverse spread than we are. Thank you very much, Anne-Elizabeth. We're going to keep an eye on that Assemblée Nationale. On yesterday's show, our friend Vicky Spitt widowed in her 30s by the COVID vaccine, revealed that after a year and a half of the NHS jabbing anything that moves, she is the first person in the United Kingdom to be informed that she will be receiving compensation for what these vaccines have done. The one-size-fits-all payment is a fairly risible amount, but as Vicky says, this is the first acknowledgement by the government that the vaccines kill people. That's a breakthrough, because a zillion internet trolls insist that there are no such persons as Vicky. Well, now the government says there are, and even the BBC has been forced to report on Vicky's story. They haven't had her on air yet. Go on, boys. She won't bite you. Put her on Question Time. Put her on the Today programme. She should be on all your big, unwatchable BBC news shows. Go on. You've mentioned her. You've broken the dam. Get her on your airwaves. At GB News, we tell the stories of Vicky and Charlotte and Claire and the others I've met in recent weeks, because so many media outlets don't. For 2 years, most of the press were happy to serve as propagandists, and indeed singled out those who resisted the propaganda as the villains of the story. It wasn't just President Macron who threatened to emmerder, piss off the unvaccinated, but Andrew Neil and Piers Morgan and Philip Schofield and others who piled on, happy to serve as fawning court eunuchs to our megalomaniac sultans. This is a huge public scandal, bigger than thalidomide, and it is thanks to brave ladies such as Vicky, far braver than all the media pom-pom girls, that we are beginning to uncover it. No thanks to the totalitarians at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the self-proclaimed fact-checkers of Full Fact, fully funded by American billionaires to kill off British free speech. For 2 years, the gutless twerps at Wikipedia listed the notion that the virus originated in a lab as the very first numero uno of their COVID conspiracy theories. They're kind of, sort of starting to walk it back now. Oh, well, not exactly walk it back, but tiptoe it back, but only because Dr. Tedros himself, the head honcho at the World Health Organization, has now signed on to the lab leak theory, at least among friends. Look at this headline. WHO chief believes COVID did leak from Wuhan lab after a catastrophic accident, despite publicly maintaining all hypotheses remain on the table. I'm tired of the big shut-up. The last 2 years have screwed our world, and we need to unscrew it all. Natalie Winters from the National Pulse joins me. Natalie, something is shifting, isn't it? It's like they're beginning to understand that at least some of the lies are not sustainable anymore.
Yeah, I really think the World Health Organization has solidified their reputation as being a body that anything they say, you should trust and believe the opposite, with this latest report coming out about Dr. Tedros, specifically with regard to the origins of COVID-19. And I think it's really important to remember that the World Health Organization, in tandem with a bunch of other scientific groups too, but really a lot of the WHO scientists and even Tedros himself, were really critical in spearheading this narrative that we saw kind of manifest in a lot of Western mainstream media outlets, that COVID-19 developed naturally via some form of wet market. And it was under this pretext that they used to silence shows like yours, to silence journalists like me. But it's really interesting what Tedros feels comfortable saying, privately, allegedly to a European government senior source. And I really think that the takeaway from the story isn't just something that we've known all along, which is that, of course, COVID-19 traces its origins to a Chinese Communist Party-run lab, but it really shows you how compromised the World Health Organization is by the Chinese Communist Party, so much so that even if the Director General believes that COVID-19 escaped from a lab, he doesn't feel comfortable actually saying that out loud.
Yeah, a lot of prime ministers and presidents around the Western world are in a similar situation. You had another fascinating story today. Yesterday, Microsoft News put up a piece saying that, in fact, the unvaccinated were at far less risk of severe COVID than all the triple vaccinated boosted crowd were. And it was up there at Microsoft News, which Bill Gates founded, and then it sort of mysteriously went away.
Yeah, this is a perfect example of a story within a story. So the study itself actually took data from over 175 countries, counting over 18,000 participants, and they found that people who weren't vaccinated against COVID-19 didn't necessarily suffer a more severe form of COVID-19, which kind of goes against the mainstream narrative that you get vaccinated, not necessarily to prevent COVID-19, but just not to have a severe case of the virus. But this study found basically the inverse to be true, or at least that getting a vaccine did not necessarily confer a less severe form of COVID-19. So those findings, again, this study wasn't funded by Big Pharma, and studies that don't have those funding conflicts of interest tend to find these similar outcomes. So that's on one front very interesting. But what's even more interesting, as you pointed out, MSN, which is basically Microsoft's news service, again, founded by the founder of Microsoft, Bill Gates, who is probably one of the largest champions of vaccines, actually erased this story that they had initially covered from their website. They didn't offer a retraction. They didn't even publicly acknowledge. It's just, if you click on the link, it's now defunct. But you can see archived versions of it still up. So it really just, I think, poses again the question of what is guiding the mainstream media's coverage of whether it be the origins of COVID-19, the vaccines and their ramifications, their efficacy, because it doesn't seem to be truth, because hiding stories, quietly in the dead of night, erasing them from the internet, doesn't necessarily suggest innocence. It suggests that there's something else going on.
Both the governor of California and the Prime Minister of Canada, just in recent days, because for some reason those guys can't seem to stop picking up the COVID again and again and again. And they both said, oh, but don't worry, because we're jabbed and boosted up the wazoo, we're not going to get a serious dose of COVID. That actually isn't borne out by the science. And as your story makes plain, Natalie, they're still basically 86ing the science, and any science that is unhelpful to them just gets put in the deep freeze and we never hear from it again.
Yeah, I won't hold my breath for any of these fact-checking organizations to issue any corrections against the governor of California or Prime Minister Trudeau. But that's, of course, because a lot of these fact-checkers, as we've actually uncovered at the National Pulse, themselves have ties, believe it or not, which I'm sure you do, to Big Pharma. Some of these organizations, which, as you pointed out, a lot of times are bankrolled by American philanthropists, basically a euphemistic term for far left activists. But a lot of these groups have ties and have funded programs at Pfizer, which really is interesting. And again, I think falls back to this overarching theme of just there are several conflicts of interest. Even just today, we put up a story in the National Pulse talking about how Facebook, their audit director and marketing leads, they're actually alumni of Pfizer. So again, it's a very, I'd say, tangled web of interests.
Oh no, absolutely, and you're better at this than anyone. Thank you very much for staying on it for us, Natalie. It's great stuff. We have Stump the Stein coming up. GB Views at gbnews.uk. Plus, wouldn't this be a better world if Natalie was a boy and I were a girl? Wouldn't you enjoy that more? It's happening, and Deborah So's here to discuss it. Stay with us. We're coming right back.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere. We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was, in fact, a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Here's how the US government marked the start of Pride Month. Look at this. That right there is the first lesbian White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, with the first transgender four-star admiral, Rachel Levine. The Taliban and the Chi-Coms have no transgender admirals. That's why they lose all their wars. Not like America. Biden's already threatening to drop a transgender admiral on the Kremlin and show Putin what's what. The one on the right, I thought, was kind of cute, though. What does lesbian mean again? What does lesbian mean again? Oh, okay, it's a bit of a long shot. Oh well, not sure I'm man enough for the one on the left. Not quite sure what I'd be getting into, but I'm beginning to get the feeling heterosexuality is a thankless endeavour these days. As you know, we've been covering the rise of the be-penised woman on this show. As recently as a decade or so back, most of the trans action, up to 90% according to some, was from male to female. Now it's a whole other ball game, or lack of ball game. Since 2010, the number of girls referred to the famous Tavistock Clinic has increased by 5,000%. And there's a lot of that about in Brighton, quote, a school hailed as the coolest state secondary in town has 76 children with gender identity issues, it was revealed yesterday. Wow, that is so totally cool. According to Pew Research, 5% of Americans aged 18 to 29 now identify as either trans or non-binary. That's 2.5 million people in that age cohort alone, or the equivalent of a non-binary Moldova if you exclude Transnistria. What's going on? I'm pleased to welcome back the author of The End of Gender, Dr. Deborah So. Deborah, what's driving all the girls to become boys?
Well, hi, Mark. It's always great to see you. I mean, this is such a sad issue to be looking at in terms of, like you said, there is this crazy increase in terms of the number of young women who are deciding to transition very quickly to male. And I think that statistic that you mentioned from the Pew Research Center speaks to part of this, in that it is trendy nowadays to identify as transgender or non-binary. And especially when you look at that cohort of young people who are between the ages of 18 and 29, the 5%, 2% identify as a transgender man or woman, and 3% identify as non-binary. And I don't think this is simply due to social acceptance or that this is just a natural organic change that we're seeing. If you actually go in and talk to young people and understand how wokeness has basically taken over in every facet of life, it really is frowned upon to be white or heterosexual nowadays. So you can't change your race. What's the next best thing? To be an ally, it is to identify as one of these exotic millions of genders, or to decide that you are really a man if you were born female. And I think this especially targets young women because they are empathic. They want to be a part of this cause and help people who are oppressed and minority classes. And so for their way of signaling their solidarity is to, in some ways, transition.
Is it just the social accessory, which I can understand might be quite appealing, or is there something rather sad underlying it? In other words, that there's some kind of profound unhappiness in deciding that you're not satisfied with who you are?
I think a lot of it, especially among young women, there has been research to show that they are struggling with other mental health issues. In many cases, they are young lesbians who are not fully comfortable with their sexuality. In other cases, it is due to other comorbidity like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, sometimes personality disorders. Some people are on the autism spectrum and they are not being able to get the care that they deserve and need. Instead, they're being swept down this path of identifying as a different gender just because they are not typically gender conforming. So maybe if they are slightly masculine girls or what used to be called a tomboy. So I do think there are many cases, other issues that are not being discussed, and society is really doing a disservice to these individuals for not looking at what's really going on.
Officialdom is actually leaping ahead of the percentages, I would say. A 65-year-old man in the UK was turned away from a blood donor bank because he refused to answer the question. He's 65 years old and he's a man. He refused to answer the question whether he was pregnant. In other words, officialdom is accelerating with this idea that you can have men with vaginas and women with penises, and it's just basically the luck of the draw now.
It's so ridiculous, and the fact that people are being discriminated against or intimidated into going along with it, or if they do speak up and say that's ridiculous, I'm a man, you should not be asking me if I'm pregnant or if I menstruate or any of this, or forcing us to use language like people who menstruate or people who give birth or whatever else weird dystopian anti-woman language that is being pushed upon us. I mean, I don't think, we've talked about this before, I don't think most people are, sensible people are on board with this. And I really think that if you have an issue with it, that you should be, you're totally within your right to speak up about it.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It is always great to see you. We're in the closing moments, and we'll do a little bit of stumping. I've got this, who sang My Way better, says James, Elvis or Sinatra? For what is a man? What has he got? If not himself, then he has naught. And these days, what has he got if he doesn't have a penis, as most men now don't seem to have, according to these statistics? That's going to do it. Dan Wootton's still in New Zealand. They don't even have telly down there, so Dan has no idea that Patrick Christys is going crazy every night. What you got, Patrick? It's very primitive society.
I tell you what, Mark, to come on after a strap on your screen with the words gender bender, I've asked them not to say that about me, but they do it anyway, and then an a cappella version of My Way. I don't know how I'm going to beat this, Mark, OK? I don't know how I'm going to beat it, right? But I'm going to give it a go. It's a strike special. You and I have managed to make it into work today, but sadly, loads of people haven't. I'm getting stuck into these pound shop trots from start to finish. I think they're an absolute menace. We've got a bit of that. We're also going to be talking about why GPs aren't going back to work. I've got a superstar panel. I tell you what, Mark, it's going to be absolutely box office. Do not miss it. 9 until 11. I'm going to get stuck right in from start to finish.
It's going to be way better than Men Without Penises and lousy versions of My Way. Patrick Christys, right? That's a useless format. Ofcom made me do it. Patrick Christys got much better one. All coming up after the weather. Stay safe, stay free.
Hello again. Clear skies overnight for many will lead to a sunny Wednesday and even warmer conditions, especially across southern and eastern parts of the UK. High pressure keeping things fine for most at the moment. A large area of high pressure in the Atlantic blocking significant rain and wind from coming our way. And as a result, for the vast majority, it is going to be a clear night, even though we've seen some cloud for northern England, central and eastern Scotland through the day. Clear spells developing here. The one area I think where we'll keep the thicker cloud and some low cloud will be the far northwest of Scotland with some outbreaks of light rain and drizzle, but clear spells elsewhere and temperatures holding up despite those clear spells, in places 13 or 14 Celsius by dawn. So a bright start for many and certainly looking like a sunnier day for northern England and eastern Scotland compared with Tuesday. Even Northern Ireland, where we start with some cloud, will brighten up with some sunshine coming through in places. But we keep the low cloud and the breeze and the cooler conditions in the far northwest of Scotland. Elsewhere, with the sunshine and light winds, temperatures respond well. Mid-20s for eastern Scotland, high 20s for eastern parts of England. Into Wednesday evening and clear spells for most once again and light winds as well. 1 or 2 mist and fog patches are possible, but for the vast majority it's another mild or even warm night. In fact, temperatures in, say, Cardiff and London won't drop below 15 or 16 Celsius, 13 for Glasgow